Okay, so now I would like to turn the floor to one of my favorite colleagues. He knows that. Joe Ferrare. He's really a very innovative scholar, and I'm very thankful that he has agreed to be one of our faculty members and our colleagues. And I'm very grateful for the research that he does, because it really impacts a great deal of what we do. Networks in action: how students create and mobilize social capital during college transitions. Joe, the floor is yours, sir.
Thanks, Karam. I appreciate it. And I haven't been here long enough to offend you, so I'm glad I'm still one of your favorite colleagues, but give it time, give it time. Okay, well, thanks so much. And just thanks again to Sarah for organizing this. I really appreciate it. It's a pleasure to have an opportunity to share some of the work that I've been doing on this topic. So I'm going to share my screen here. So I'm just going to start out with some motivation for this particular topic. So we all know here, everyone in this room knows that institutions of higher ed are under increasing pressure to ensure timely degree completion and as well as opportunities in the labor market. We've seen things like the college scorecard, as well as just the number of programs that are aimed at student persistence. So the environment in this regard is urgent, I think, to say the least. And we know from prior research that students' social networks play a key role in both of these processes, both in terms of student persistence and degree completion, as well as opportunities in the labor market. However, far less is known about how these networks actually form. So a lot of previous work, especially Granovetter's work and Armstrong and Hamilton, they show sort of the implications for students' networks. So how they offer support, how they allow for students to have access to valued information that gives them ins for certain jobs or certain groups or fellowships on campus. But how do students actually form these ties? And that's where sort of the basis of the work that I'm trying to contribute to, and that's what I'll be talking about in this talk. And so I'm going to, just to give you a little bit of an overview, I'm going to situate the projects that I'm discussing in social capital theory. I'm going to briefly mention an initial study that was done that served as the kind of impetus for the SRCP pilot that I did last year. The initial study focuses on the high school to college transition. The pilot that I did through SRCP funds last year was the college to career transition. And the reason for focusing on these transitions is because these are the moments when students need to develop new networks, especially in the high school to college transition. So their networks get disrupted because they're coming to a new place, a new institution. They have to form new ties. And some of the most impactful research in higher education shows just how crucial those tie formations are to their success as undergraduates. But then also being able to mobilize the social capital that they've developed in college and then putting that to work as they transition into their career is another important phase. And then I'll talk a little bit about implications and next steps. Okay, so probably most of you have heard the term social capital. It comes from a long tradition of research in social capital theory, a lot of it in sociology, but now it's an interdisciplinary field. You'll see it a lot in business. You'll see it a lot in medical education research. Really, it's everywhere. It's grounded in the work of the late sociologist Pierre Bourdieu. And the idea being that the structure and composition of our networks provide us with access to certain resources. And a lot of the work comes from an individual perspective. So we think about actors who purposefully or strategically form ties with individuals or organizations as a way to fulfill certain objectives. And those could be to provide themselves with social support, and that usually comes in the form of peer or friendship networks, but also to facilitate their own economic mobility and status attainment, political objectives, whatever they might be. And so just to give you a general idea, if you're not as familiar with social capital theory, the idea is that one's position and the structure of their network both facilitates certain resources, but also can constrain them in certain ways. So I've circled a hypothetical actor here, and you can see that this actor has ties to disconnected others, meaning you can see they're tied directly to 3 people, but those 3 people that they're tied to are not tied to one another. So if this was, let's say, a career advice seeking network, meaning people that they turn to get advice about their potential career prospects, this research has shown is probably a good thing because they're tied to distinct sets of people, they're probably going to get novel information. Now, of course, it depends on who they are actually tied to, the composition of those networks. But from a structural point of view, this is considered to be advantageous in those kinds of network environments. If this is a social support network, then it might not be as advantageous. So say, for example, this person is me, and I go to one of those people and say, I'm having a hard time, I'm feeling a little bit depressed. Because those people don't know each other, it's more difficult for my network to mobilize to support me. But imagine I'm this person. And so in my personal network, everybody knows everyone else. That is, everyone is tied to one another. If this is my career advice seeking network, this may not be that advantageous because I'm likely to get redundant information. Everybody knows everybody else, probably everybody, because they know everyone else, has shared information with one another. So I'm not as likely to be able to retrieve novel information. But if this is a social support network, then any one of these people that I go to with a problem is probably going to share that with the other people, and so they can mobilize to support me. So this is sort of the impetus behind the individual perspective of social capital. But there's another perspective to social capital theory, and that's the organizational one. And in this way, this is primarily grounded initially from the work of sociologist Mario Small, who argues that in thinking about social capital, it's also important not only to think about what it offers us, but also how it forms and where it forms. And mostly these ties form within organizational contexts. I'm interested in universities, but you can imagine how this is social ties form in community organizations, in religious organizations, in various health care organizations, through community activist groups. There's all kinds of organizational contexts within which we make ties to other people and to other organizations. And organizations in particular can actively and passively broker ties. So just what we saw in Joey's presentation and the Q&A afterwards, where Cinnamon and others were talking about other organizations or other groups or other people doing different kinds of research, this is a form of organizational brokerage. This is where we sort of bring together other types of organizations or connect others with work that we feel might be relevant. And so we saw actually organizational brokerage happening in real time, which I thought was really interesting. However, we also know that organizations are not neutral spaces. In many cases, they can be classed, they can be raced, they can be constituted by a variety of inequitable power relations. And these can shape the way organizational brokerage unfolds, depending on the kinds of network processes that we're talking about. And so as a result, network formation and the ways people activate those networks, in my case, I'm interested in students, it can be highly uneven. And so it was this is the theoretical foundation that my work is emerging from, is this organizational perspective, but also being attentive to the unevenness that takes place, because universities, as we know, are often a microcosm of inequities in broader society. So in the initial study that kind of grounds all of this work, I mentioned this was focused on the high school to college transition. And I sought to answer 2 questions. One, how do the organizational contexts of universities shape incoming students' creation of social capital? So what are organizations doing that shape these processes of tie formation? And then what are the main factors that can disrupt social capital creation, and for whom? So this took place at what I'll refer to as Southeastern University. I'm anonymizing all the research participants and sites here. It was a public flagship university in the Southeast US. And my research team and I conducted 108 interviews with 62 incoming first-generation college-going students in the fall and spring of 2017. So these were longitudinal interviews. Not all of the students participated in both, but most did. And you'll note too the year. So this was the 2016 election, which proved to be very important to what we found in our work. So this was largely an interview-based study, but we did get their administrative records. So all students consented to providing us with their transcripts. We conducted field observations. We were able to pay students $20 per interview. So the students who did both interviews got $40. And I just note here, this is a collaboration with students who at the time were graduate students working with me and are all now off doing wonderful things in higher education. So I'm going to move through this pretty quick because this is sort of just background, but the main thing that we found in our work was that there's something that we referred to as a snowball effect of social capital creation. And basically what we found is that campus organizations actively and passively helped students establish an initial affiliation with an organization, and that then snowballed into a broader network through which students grafted into the university, through which they found their place, but more importantly, found one another. And some of the most common active ways was through student-based clubs, as well as other formal organizations. On Southeastern's campus had a very large Greek system. But in addition to that, there were a lot of interest-based groups. One that came up often was a social justice-oriented group that actually reached out to students before they even got to campus as new students to help them sort of have a place as soon as they arrived. But even smaller events such as Orientation Week, which didn't work for everyone, but it did help certain students make this initial connection, which then snowballed into more relevant ties for their academic and social success. But there were even passive ways the university did this, and this was just providing physical space on campus. Cafes, study rooms, dorms, so much tie formation took place in these contexts, and it was not orchestrated by the university. It was just providing space for students to do what they already know how to do. And a lot of this was structured as well around academic majors. So I'm just going to give you an example of the snowball effect. Anna was one of our student participants. Anna joined a social justice oriented living learning program as an incoming student. And so made this initial affiliation with the LLP, met her first friend through the LLP dorm, followed that friend to a Latino student union meeting, then joined the Latino student union. Through that Latino student union, met her boyfriend, and then helped create her larger friend group through that organization. And then by the end of the year, when we interviewed her again, she had just accepted a job as a peer mentor through the Latino student union. So this is textbook social integration from a higher education perspective. This is what we want students to do, because this is how they become tied to the university. This is how they become committed to the university and develop a social support network that they need to succeed. However, we found that this process was disrupted through three primary mechanisms. One, what I call the social alienation of economic constraint. So students who were low income and who often had to work frequently. And I'll just point back to that these are all first generation students, but not all first generation students are low income. And part of the rationale for focusing just on first gen students, one was to problematize the homogeneity, or thinking about first gen students in a homogeneous way. They're actually quite diverse group of students. And so what we found was that those who needed to work often missed out on affiliating in the kinds of spaces and organizations through which students developed that snowball effect. And this was by far the most common disruption to the snowball effect. Another common one was anti-Black racism on this campus. So during the year in which our fieldwork took place, a number of the students, Black students that we interviewed, referenced being called racial slurs. In one instance, a notable instance on this campus, a racial slur was written on a dorm wall in a hallway. And a number of Black students who we interviewed lived in this dorm. And if they didn't, they certainly heard about the instance. It was actually a widely known instance on campus. Other Black students experienced exclusion, social exclusion. There were a number of instances that I can point to, as well as white supremacy symbolism, both in the form of, again, this is during the 2016 election. There were a number of trucks that were driving through campus with Confederate flags and Trump flags, as well as the campus's own art. There were some artworks on campus that depicted slave ownership. And this was a major conversation throughout the year. But the bottom line is in spaces where students created social capital, Black students were experiencing anti-Black racism, and this was a major disruption to the snowball effect. It's caused a lot of retrenchment, a lot of alienation, and for many students, transferring away from the university. And then finally, just organizational overload. And this is just a sense of being overwhelmed by not only the size of Southeastern's campus, but in some cases just the sheer number of experiences available to them. And I'll just quote one student who I think captured it well. I feel like a tiny piece of sand at the ocean. I feel like there's so many things going on and I'm just not part of any of it. And this just captured the student who felt so overwhelmed, could see all of these things happening, but just couldn't really find a way in amidst the expansiveness of the organizational structure of campus. So this is kind of a snapshot of that work, but it led to wanting to look at this from the perspective of a different transition, that is, as students move from college into their career pathways. And that's where the SRCP study comes in. And this was meant to be a pilot study with the objective of developing a survey instrument that could bring some quantitative data to this sort of theoretical development, as well as looking more generally at the feasibility of scaling such a study up to looking at multiple campuses. And the pilot study here was guided by these questions. So what's the size and composition of graduating students' campus and career-oriented social networks? What sources of information do they draw upon as they navigate the college to career transition? How do they engage their networks as they transition from college to career? And in what ways do campus programs or practices facilitate or constrain the development of their job-seeking and career advice-seeking networks? So I developed both a survey and an interview protocol. So the survey is meant to capture network structure. The interview is to capture process. So in particular, I was interested in capturing participation in co-curricular programs, internships, as well as student groups, and then to capture their personal networks for career and job-seeking behaviors, as well as some background characteristics. And then the interview protocol was meant to try and unpack the processes through which those affiliations and network structures took shape. So you can think of it in terms of the survey capturing the what and the interview capturing the how. So this took place at what I'm referring to as Northwest University, a small public university. The survey itself, the pilot, we were able to capture 104 students, a racially diverse sample with about 40% first generation college going. This largely reflected the total population from which the sample was drawn. And then interviews were conducted with 12 students, racially diverse, but all continuing generation students. So this is certainly that was a major limitation of the interview data we got, but we still nevertheless got really important feedback on the protocol itself from an instrument development point of view. We weren't able to use financial incentives in this case, and this is partially why we had the low response rate, also why we had likely all continuing generation students. But it did, nevertheless, the data we got was robust enough to do some initial analysis. So conducted some network analysis of the surveys, and then some thematic segmentation and coding of the transcripts. And I just want to thank some MAPS 2021 grads, Allison Fuller in particular, who was instrumental with the project from start to finish, serving as both a research coordinator, but as well doing a lot of analysis and help in data collection. And Sharon Choker and Ava Karami helped in doing some of the interviews. So I'll just get to some of what we were able to learn through the pilot data. The first is that, when you think about the groups that students join and affiliate with, probably many of us think about it just atomistically, and I don't mean that as a critique, I just mean that's sort of a natural way. Students just pick groups, they join them. But when you think about it from a network perspective, then you imagine that there's an order to the way students affiliate with social groups. And so what this shows here is a network graph of affiliation. So each node here, each circle, is a student group on campus. I've suppressed the labels just to not reveal the identity. However, you can see that by using what's referred to as a community detection algorithm, so these three central clusters here, the activism and affinity, career and professional and technology, this algorithm detects sort of cohesive subgroups within the network. These are just dense subsets of student group affiliations. And you can see they took form around these three broad themes. So in the upper left, the activism and affinity, these student groups reflected students who tended to co-affiliate with the same kinds of student groups. Again, the theme underlying this community was activism and affinity, a lot of racial and ethnic-based affinities and groups that were aimed towards social justice and other forms of activism. Another subgroup focused on career and professional objectives and trajectories. So a lot of groups that were focused on kind of whether they were topically oriented, maybe it was STEM oriented, or maybe it was health oriented, but the idea being that these were groups that were aimed at supporting students in their career objectives. And then finally, a technology community. And these were groups that were focused largely on tech-oriented groups, whether that had to do with computer science and coding, or could have had to do with really any technological objective that students joined. Then you can see there's a lot of isolates. I suspect with more robust data, those isolates would become part of these other communities. We'd have a lot of limitations with respect to the small data. But the point here is that with better data, we could actually then begin to map onto these communities attributes. So which students are joining these different communities? In what ways are our students kind of self-segregating into these various subsets of groups? And what groups on campus might we leverage to help reach many of our students? So for instance, you can see there's one central node within this graph that sort of acts as a link to all of the different communities. I'll say in this particular one, it's the Black Student Union. Something like this could help us understand how we might coordinate or leverage various sources of information with our students. So another thing that I was interested in was to understand the structure of program affiliations, of co-curricular affiliations. And again, there's a latent structure that we can detect through these community detection algorithms. On Northwest campus, one of those was a global experiences and careers community. Another was emphasizing research and community impact. And then finally, one that emphasized alumni networks. Okay, so I'm going to move a little more quickly here. I realize I only have a few more minutes. So another thing that we wanted to capture in the survey was the career advice seeking network. So thinking about the student groups and the program affiliations as sort of context in which students form ties, when it came down to who did they go to for advice about their careers and their college to career transition, we found that on average, the average network size was 4, but there was a significant variation. The middle 50% of the distribution was from 3 to 6, but we also had a substantial chunk of students who had no one. So when asked in the last 6 months, to whom did you turn to for advice about career, whether related to a job or to graduate school or other post-college opportunities, 12% of the students said they had no one to go to for that, or at least went to no one. And then you can see there was a even split of network members from Northwestern or Northwest and non-Northwest members. These were not surprisingly highly educated networks and economically advantaged, primarily white, and of moderate density. And if you think back to what I talked about previously about the density of the network having both advantages and disadvantages, and this is what the average network actually looked like. So a size of 4 where ego is the focal student, and with about a third to half of the actors within their network knowing one another. But we could also understand that even, when you look at this from an average, right, if you look at it from the mean, you don't really get a sense of the strategies that students used. And this multidimensional scaling plot gives us a sense of that. And what an MDS plot does is it basically shows how these strategies clustered together. And there were very clear, even from our small sample size of 104 students, there were very clear, distinct strategies that students chose. So 5 in particular. In the middle, you can see NWU, that's Northwest University, weak ties, meaning some students primarily focused on professors, staff, and career services from the focal university, from Northwest University. Other students focused on non-Northwest University weak ties. And by weak ties, I mean those who are, they're sort of acquaintances. And if you're familiar with the network literature, you'll recognize weak ties as providing certain advantages in the job market. There were also informal weak ties, so students who turned to classmates, to family, friends, and coworkers as sources of information about career and job information. And then another primary strategy was what I referred to, and others refer to as strong ties. So these were people going to family and friends. But what's noteworthy is up in the upper left, this personal, that means personal research. A number of students, and likely correlates with those who said they have no one, are just doing their own, relying on their own personal research for career and job information. And while we might laud their sort of diligence, we also know how job seeking and how the job market works, and that it works best when you have sort of information and you have access to ties who can help facilitate or broker connections. So finally, I'll just speak briefly to the process side of things. And remember the limitations here. These are all continuing generation students, so keep that in mind. But there was evidence of the snowball effect with respect to these career networks. And we found that course-related events, so a guest lecturer or a speaker from industry, often brokered really important ties. These were like one-off events or even formal club events and alumni networking. But it didn't take much for students to make this connection that often led to a really important professional tie for them. And a lot of the non-Northwest University ties that we observed through the survey, what we found in the interviews, those were brokered through Northwest University organizations and faculty, and especially co-curricular programs on campus. Those proved to be really important ways that students made professional connections to non-Northwest University organizations, which is what ideally I think any university wants. There was a lot of brokerage happening through highly educated families. So this isn't a surprise given that these students, the subset of students, were all from highly educated families. These students were also wary of a one-size-fits-all strategy by the institution. They want to know that the information that they're accessing or that is being sort of presented to them has them in mind. And so that's something that emerged to be really important. So just to wrap up, across all both of these studies, it does not take much, apparently, to set the snowball effect in motion. Just a simple affiliation with an organization, or in the case of career networking, having a speaker come to a class for an hour. These kinds of brief ad hoc strategies can be very effective. Knowing with whom they're effective is going to require more research. But I will say, even among more disadvantaged and marginalized groups, we found that it worked the same. What didn't work the same is how easily it could be disrupted, right? And so this is where low income and racially and ethnically marginalized students were much more vulnerable to the disruption. It's possible for institutions to try too hard and overwhelm some students with so much information and so many opportunities. It can become almost suffocating for some students and causes almost a sense of immobility and not knowing where to begin. Also, there is a latent structure to programs and groups. So I think it's really important to think about, there are these latent experiences that students are going through. And it would be really helpful, I think, for higher education, student affairs, and faculty to understand what those structures are on campus, as well as to know that, at least in the pilot study, students tended to pursue a relatively homogeneous network strategy for career advice. This could be effective for some students, but we may want to think about trying to make those strategies more heterogeneous so they're not putting everything into one basket. But I'll say all of this, the evidentiary basis is still weak. So the last point I'll make here is that questions for future work with better data. I really want to know more about what sets the snowball effect in motion. And so for that, I want better quantitative data, frankly, so that we can run some what are called exponential random graph models. And this is a way to predict tie formation while accounting for the network structure itself. And then within that, are there any organizational characteristics that are malleable? So are there things driving tie formation that we can learn quantitatively that point to things the organization, in this case, the university, is doing, that we could actually control, that we can do more of, do less of, do differently? And then how can we integrate network data collection into higher education? This is something I'm thinking about more generally. Brokerage of social capital is what distinguishes the value of higher education. We are a social capital generating machines. Yes, we offer content expertise, but that content expertise is increasingly available to anyone who wants it. But what isn't available is the social capital that universities make available. And so I think collecting this kind of data should become more standard, especially, you know, collecting all kinds of data. At the same time, institutions are becoming increasingly bureaucratized and conservative, and collecting this data is becoming more of a challenge. And I don't say that as a critique. I say that as that's a rational response to what universities are increasingly being expected to do, but it does present its challenges for collecting this kind of data. So thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Joe, for your presentation. Obviously, this research has amazing implications and limitless, honestly. So fantastic. Thank you so much. And I think the two, between Joey's project and Joe's project, it kind of highlights some of the amazing, impactful work that our faculty have done in two different schools. It's really it's very impressive. So thank you for that. Okay, so any questions for Joe? Happy to. The floor is yours. Please do that little function, of course, of, you know, raise your hand if possible, or just jump right in. All right, Cinnamon, I knew that you were going to ask a question.
Thank you, Joe. This has been so much here to think about. I'm just wondering, as you're thinking about, you know, how to put this into practice, if you were thinking about how to put this into practice, what would you recommend to practitioners like me who really are thinking about student success and wanting to make sure, you know, especially those transitions into college, into your major, and then into your career or graduate school, how to ease on those? What would be like the #1 takeaway you would give to me or someone like me?
It's a great question. I mean, I think based on what I know now, I would say, you know, just to point back to this idea of providing opportunities for students to make an initial connection to a university organization. So as students are incoming, helping them understand what organizations are out there, and ideally it coming from other students, because that's who they trust the most. That's where they you know, they look upon us with a degree of skepticism. And a lot of the prior research, you know, even before my own work, shows that students are turning to each other to get information about their major, about classes, and about groups that they should be joining. So I would say, you know, figuring out, working with student ambassadors and other student mentors to help incoming students know what the kind of group structure actually looks like on campus, to give them a mapping of what that looks like, so they have a sense of what are different experiences they can chart for themselves. Because when they first get there, in our interviews, the way they experienced it a lot of times was just like these random opportunities coming at them. But when presented in a way that it sort of reduced the complexity of that reality, it was, I think, a lot more beneficial. And you know, when I saw, like, we were doing these tracks, or are they called tracks?
Meta majors, yeah.
Meta majors, that's the kind of things that I'm talking about, is data reduction, right, into these themes. But what's great about an organization on campus is they can help bring some form for students to the social environment of the campus. So I would say, like, facilitating that initial affiliation, and to structure it around their majors. A lot of students form their friendship groups and their identities around their majors. So to the extent that we can sort of foster connections between social opportunities and the academic opportunities, I think that students find that really valuable as well.
Wonderful. Thank you, Cinnamon. Thank you, Joe. Pam?
Hi, this is Cara, Joe, behind this mask.
Oh, hey, how are you doing? Good to see you.
For your presentation. This is a follow-up to Cinnamon's question. Thinking about, is there research when students are actually learn about social network theory, like thinking about Kim's here in career services and their freshmen or orientation, they're actually presented with this theory where then they can intentionally understand as they're making, versus a student that does social network theory but isn't aware of it. Is there research kind of, if you present the students with this model, that they're more likely to be successful in creating a social network?
That's a great question. So it's actually ongoing right now. I have a colleague at Cal State, not Fullerton, one of the Cal States in Southern California. No, it is Fullerton, sorry. So at Cal State Fullerton, who started what's called the Social Capital Academy. And the attempt is to do just that, is to actually be very intentional about sort of introducing students to social capital theory and how it works. And a lot of students, especially students who are from families where parents have had college education, they at least at a tacit level know these rules, and they're getting coached. And there's mounds of research that shows how parents, highly educated parents, prepare their kids for these kinds of strategies. They may not call it social capital theory, but they understand very clearly how this game is played. It's really first gen students in particular who maybe aren't getting that information from their parents, because by definition, their parents didn't go to college. It's not like a critique of their parents. It's just a reality that if you didn't go to college, you're not going to convey information about college going and how the rules of college operate. And so this is where I think actually that can be potentially more effective. And my colleague at Cal State Fullerton, they serve a large number of first gen students. And so that's part of the reason why he's starting that program there. And part of that will be, they'll evaluate its efficacy, and he just launched it right now. So it's something that I think we'll be learning about more in the future.
Great, thanks, Joe.
Sure.
Thank you. All right, Kim Wilson.
Hey, Joe, thanks so much for this. This is fascinating.
Sure.
I'm really curious about the 12%. And I know that it's two different universities, two different studies, but really curious about what are some of those characteristics of the 12%. And, if there were disruptions, as you discussed in the first study, that would be things that are barriers for those students seeking out these kinds of pieces of career advice.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I don't have a lot to speak to, in part because it was such a, it was a pilot study. So the data, the sample is pretty small. And so the 12%, if you think about it, is actually, it's somewhere between, that's like, it's plus or minus 6. So, I mean, it's really, it could be 6, it could be 18, right? It's somewhere in that range. And so, but even still, it's a big chunk. And, for some students, especially I've learned a lot through these studies, the ones who have to work, they just are tapped. Like they simply have nothing left in the tank to go to any of these. Like they know, they can see that, hey, the Career Center is offering this workshop, or hey, the Husky handshake is happening. But if you're working after and before and in between class, then you're sort of maxed out. So a big part of it is the work piece. Certainly at Southeastern, there was a serious, racism played an important role in the ways that students interacted with campus, and it caused a lot of segregation. It was a very racially segregated campus as well, both in terms of where students ended up living, but also where they hung out during the day. For example, like North Campus versus South Campus, it was like two campuses. And these experiences drive students into certain spaces, and this has serious implications. And the way a university responds, like at least at Southeastern, the university response was very poor. At one point, they put a blanket over this mural, the mural that I described that depicted slave ownership, but it didn't really host a lot of conversations about it, right? So it was like, hey, well, let's just cover this up, but let's not really talk about it. So that, is obviously very problematic, and students pay attention to how universities respond to traumatic and problematic events. So I think that's a big piece of it. Some students, it's very idiosyncratic. I mean, I interviewed one student at Northwest University. He was very shy and just didn't really want to show up to a lot of these events. And you also have to remember, I collected data during the time when the campus was closed. And so, a lot of this could have had to do with the fact that students weren't even allowed to be on campus. A lot of things shifted to virtual opportunities. Some students might have been Zoomed out. I mean, there's a lot of possibilities. I really think more work needs to be done to learn about it. I wish I could say more definitively, but I was kind of shocked by that too, and definitely concerned, and but want to learn more about it.
Wonderful. Thank you. All right, Marie.
Thank you, Joe, so much for this presentation. So I will follow up with you offline because I want to make more social capital networking things happen. But I thought I'd ask one discrete question that came to me in one chart. And I don't mean to attach two of your slides to each other inappropriately, but in one set of networks, you had alumni that looked really small off in the corner by itself. And then in another area, you were reporting that students feel most comfortable approaching and connecting with fellow students. I just kind of wonder, at what point does the you're an adult distrust happen? Like, is it young alums? Are they still considered students, do you think? There might not be data about that, but maybe you can guess, because part of that transition isn't just what's happening on our campus, but I know trying to increase our alumni network through the Career Center and through other ways is one of the goals that we have as a division. So I'm just curious where the young alums in particular might play an important role as opposed to alumni more generically.
That's an interesting question. So just so I understand right, so you were saying on the one hand, I was noting that students primarily, they turn to each other for advice, but in another, alumni networks were an important piece. Is that?
No, I was just noticing that the alumni network didn't seem very big.
Oh,
and then you also told me that they trust students and they don't want to talk to others, right? So I just wonder, are they related? Maybe they're not. I'm just curious because it seems like that's a really fertile ground for us to think about. The early students, right?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I guess I can't say for sure where the distrust of let's say institutional actors comes from. I don't know if it's as much an overt distrust of like older institutional actors as much as it's an overt trust of their peer networks. And this has to do with the fact that like as I mentioned at the beginning, so in a dense peer network, those networks are really valuable for providing social support. And so then you end up just going to those people for a lot of other things. And I think that in some respects, it's not as if we should say like our alumni aren't valuable to us, but I think to the extent that students are able to relate to the alumni that they are working with, I think that would bolster the amount of trust they would have in what they are offering to them. But that's something I feel like would be also really interesting follow-up, would be to focus on something like a specific alumni program like Husky Handshake or some other program that we have where we're attempting to connect our students with alumni, is to actually do a formal evaluation to understand, which of those connections work and which ones don't work. I can't really speak directly to like the distrust of older people, but I can say that to the extent that students are able to relate to other students or to other people, like that gives that signals to them that they can trust that information. And I think that's where, once they feel like they can trust that information, they seem to be more likely to want to act on it.
Yeah, that's helpful. I'll connect with you sometime because I have questions for another day.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Marie. That's really a fantastic question. It
is a great question.
Well, I'd like to before I hand it over to Sarah, I'd like to say that this has been a fantastic day for me because I'm able to hear two different kinds of research, both talk about impact. One that is data driven, obviously, about the college experience, about social capital theory. And it's quite interesting because the implications are really limitless in terms of organizational structure, higher education. And we oftentimes talk about the college experience, but we don't really necessarily break it down to the basics of it. So thank you, Joe, for doing all that. And I think there's plenty. I definitely would love to see, the research grow, and hopefully you'll get a whole lot more grant money to do this and replicate it elsewhere. For all the questions that Kim has raised, for all the questions that Marie has raised and others, and Cinnamon, to actually be addressed honestly once and for all. Well, let's hope so. And I also would like to highlight the sort of impact that Joey is making in terms of the work that she's doing with her co-PIs, especially that it really is creating that connection. And if I can actually see both presentations today somewhat speaking to one another, right? How does the education that comes from within the university, the university experience or the college experience, how does that actually carry over to the post-graduation period? So I see Joey and her research creating opportunities for people during college years, and also participating in such a fantastic project that leads them to doing amazing things, building on top of that. So to create that sense of community, be it a student group, be it a faculty member, that idea of mentorship, I see them all speaking to each other. So thank you very much for such a very informative talks today. Okay, so any other questions?
I did actually have one comment for Joe's presentation. I'm looking for my note here. I thought it was very interesting. And I think that the idea of the students wary of the one size fits all strategies by the institution. And I actually, I'm very interested in business and creating things. And one thing that I love doing is customizing, really great gifts, but that is like one of the biggest trends in business right now. And I think that really has trickled down to what we expect, like when we go to a restaurant, or what we expect when we go to college, is the idea of customizing something to ourselves. So those one fit models don't really work so much anymore, because we want things really tailored to us. That's how we just experience life these days. And I think that that's really interesting. I think that's everything. So last minute thoughts? All right, thank you so much for joining us. Have a wonderful evening and a wonderful holiday.